Standing beneath the serene sky overlooking these broad fields, the mighty Alleghanies, dimly towering before us, the graves of our brethren beneath our feet. It is with hesitation that I raise my poor voice to break the eloquent silence of God and nature. Those, of course, are the immortal words of the Gettysburg Address. You know, the other one. This is the address before the one you learn about in school, the one given by Edward Everett. Accomplished man, Harvard-trained, former Unitarian minister with a PhD from a German college. Former president of Harvard, former governor, congressman, senator, secretary of state, you name it. And yes, he was the vice presidential candidate on the Constitutional Union Party in 1860. This was not an unknown man. He technically ran against Lincoln. As part of that effort, he received the votes of two Confederate states, Tennessee and Virginia, to be their vice president. This was a national figure. He was a great speaker, and dedicating battlefields was, as you might say, old hat. When he died, they would call him a modern-day Cicero, and with good reason. So that's why, after the poet Longfellow declined making a speech at the ceremony, the poet Whittier declined making a speech at the Gettysburg site, few others declined. They called on Edward Everett. It was a logical choice. The person to sound the proper note needed for this dedication. It was November 1863. Thousands of spectators for what was just 4 months ago a deadly battlefield. Oh, and after this great speaker, the President of the United States was invited to give a few remarks. But we'll get to that. Everett was a professor of Greek literature, and you could tell in his speech, he went on. It was appointed by law in Athens that the ceremonies of the citizens who fell in battle should be performed at the public expense and in the most honorable manner. Such were the tokens of respect required to be paid at Athens to the memory of those who had fallen in the cause of their country. And shall I, fellow citizens, who after an interval of 23 centuries, a youthful pilgrim from the world unknown to ancient Greece, ready to put off the shoes from off my feet, as one that stands on holy ground, who have gazed with respectful emotion on the mound which still protects the dust of those who rolled back the tide of Persian invasion. Yes, I guess that's a long way of saying, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. You get the point. Everett said in 2 hours what Lincoln said in a few minutes. One journalist years later would say he couldn't even get his pencil out in time to write down anything Lincoln said. So the quick version of this historical moment is, one does a long speech after the other does a short speech, and the short one had more impact in the future, in history. That's true, and even if you noted the contrast between the length of the speeches and the powerful nature of Lincoln's speech, even in that day. But you know, the speeches had two different goals, and maybe history's being a tad unfair here to Everett. It was a cemetery dedication. It had to be strong enough. And Everett accomplished some things that had to be accomplished that day. Lincoln was the follow-up. And so Everett's was to give a lot of context and to make sure that the Confederate government got the blame for what happened on the battlefield. Let's go into Everett's oration a little more. He said of the brave Union soldiers that they rolled back the tide of an invasion, not less unprovoked, not less ruthless, than that which came to plant the dark banner of Asiatic despotism and slavery on the free soil of Greece. So it's more than just a memorial. Everett's is an indictment. And I think it's interesting to bring yourself back to listen a little more than maybe what you care to of that first Gettysburg Address, because you see the different take on the battle in the North during the war in what would be a fairly partisan audience, of course, at the Gettysburg dedication site. We think of Gettysburg now, and it's, the great battle, blue and gray. Both sides fought honorably, right? It doesn't matter what side they fought on, it was all good. But I've always looked at this to say, and I have to admit, I have a northern bias, but I've always looked at this and said, what did Pennsylvania think? I mean, they were being invaded by an army that was claiming only defense. Everett gives you that Yankee spin. It was an invasion. More than that, Everett calls them bloodthirsty. Here goes more. The time this threat was made, the rebellion was confined to the cotton-growing states, and it was well understood by them. The only hope of drawing any of the other slave-holding states into the conspiracy was in bringing about a conflict of arms and firing the heart of the South by the infusion of blood. The capture of Washington has been continually had in view. Translation, they want blood, and they want to take the capital, your capital. This is what Everett was saying. It is in reality a war originally levied by ambitious men in the cotton-growing states for the purpose of drawing the slave-holding border states into the vortex of conspiracy, first by sympathy, which in the case of southeastern Virginia, North Carolina, part of Tennessee, and Arkansas succeeded, and then by force, and for the purpose of subjugating Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, and Missouri. And it is a most extraordinary fact, considering the clamors of the rebel chiefs on the subject of invasion, that not a soldier of the United States has entered the states last named, except to defend their Union-loving inhabitants from the armies and guerrillas of the rebels. You get the purpose of this Gettysburg Address, very different than Lincoln's, making the case, a different type of case, a more contemporary case, for what the Union did at Gettysburg had fought for, to stave off a very invasion, a crusade that was involving a lot of people who didn't want to be part of it. And so when the president marches on the ground here, a long speech would not have been welcome, would not have been necessary, would not have been possible. He was just to give the executive blessing, to express the resolve of the government. The Union states that had lost native sons in the Gettysburg campaign had funded and prepared the site without federal help. That's the way that you did it then. The federal government, in charge of the army, did pay for the coffin. And while he did change from some of his rhetoric on making it a war for just protecting the Union to a war for freedom and democracy now. But you can also see in Everett's speech that some of that was there. Life or death struggle, defending freedom. That's in Everett's speech too. So my purpose is not really to make a contrast between Lincoln's and Everett's speech, but to place Lincoln's speech in the proper context for what his purpose was and for what the purpose of the event was, a dedication. What was the reaction to the Gettysburg Address at the time? It depends on where you go and who you ask and who remembers. Lincoln's burly friend, Ward Hall Lamon, had a big influence on how the speech would be interpreted in the future. He said it was a flat failure, and he said that Lincoln himself said it was a failure. Lamon, that speech won't scour, Lincoln allegedly told him. Talking about, the farmer's plow won't scour the ground, that kind of thing. But Lamon was seen as a bit of a Lincoln opportunist after his death, getting whatever money he can. He wrote a biography that was full of stories. He spoke at lectures. A scoundrel who foisted himself on my husband, Mary Todd Lincoln would say about Ward Hall Lamon. John Nicolay, one of Lincoln's secretaries, would dispute most of Lamon's memories, including this one. Nicolay said the speech, the Gettysburg Address that we know, was interrupted several times with applause, even as short as it was. Indeed, a journalist, Merritt Halstead of the Cincinnati Chronicle, he said in reaction to hearing Lamon's memories, all hearts were subdued, and whatever men felt was only seen in the quivering lip and silent tear. It split the Chicago papers. One Chicago paper, the Tribune, said, the dedicatory remarks by President Lincoln will live among the annals of man. Meanwhile, the Chicago Times said, the cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, and dish-watery remarks of the man who has to be pointed out as the President of the United States. Gosh, I from time to time have my critics, but I hope no one will call my remarks dishwatery. There was some dispute when a paper in the 1890s said that no one but the front rows could hear what Lincoln was saying. The vast throng could not. A person who had a memory of standing on the outer periphery of thousands of people said Lincoln had a clear, distinct voice and he could hear him. This was 30 years later. And there's disputing accounts between journalists and friends of Lincoln whether there was applause or interruptions in the speech. @Civil History tweets me, and by the way, you can tweet me at @myhist, @MYHIST. I love Twitter. I'm getting some good feedback on Twitter. It's nice. @civil_history tweets me. Love the podcast. Would love to hear some Civil War topics. Would love to hear about immediate reactions on Lincoln's speech on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line and how it became the defining speech of his presidency. Well, thanks. It's a good question. And does it have a lot to do with the politics of today? A little. Because if we think about this and we discuss this, what we're really talking about is how is an event interpreted in the future as opposed to the contemporary circumstances, the contemporary reporting. And it gives you a little clue as to what certain events now that we don't maybe see is that important. How are they going to play in history? And it might be quite different if the Gettysburg Address was. Let's get into it. There was a lot of reaction, some of it good and some of it bad. I doubt our national literature contains a finer gem than that little speech at the Gettysburg celebration. So said Horace Greeley. The battle itself was less important than the speech. Ideas are always more important than battles. Charles Sumner. And these weren't always friends to Lincoln. They were sometimes critics. So it's all the more heartwarming to hear their comments, except that their opinions came after his death. The Patriot and Union newspaper of nearby Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a city that was protected by the stand at Gettysburg, right? You'd think they'd be grateful. Here's what the Patriot and Union said. The president acted without sense and without constraint in a panorama that was gotten up more for the benefit of his party than for the honor of the deed. We pass over the silly remarks of the president. For the credit of the nation, we are willing that the veil of oblivion shall be dropped over them, and they shall no more be repeated or thought of. Harper's Weekly. The oration by Mr. Everett was smooth and cold. The few words of the president were from the heart to the heart. They cannot be read, even without kindling emotion. It was a partisan time. He was a partisan, divisive president, only controlling a faction of his party. Yet I suspect that the speech did score, not just in history, not just in the future, although it became bigger then, but it was noted in the contemporary times. Oh, nice little speech. Now, when you get to reaction on the other side of the Mason-Dixon line, it gets more complicated. First of all, you have to remember that the Confederates hated Lincoln, but they hated Everett because he had run on the John Bell Constitutional Union ticket and gotten the votes of Virginia, and now he was a supporter of the war, a supporter of the Lincoln administration. You kind of hate a traitor more than you just hate an enemy that you knew was an enemy. Everett got a lot of the venom. And as the Confederate papers were not part of the Associated Press or Northern Wire Services, they had formed their own little Confederate press corps. There was a Richmond press corps. But it was a little slow in getting information, and for the first few days, it didn't appear that they had anything to say about Lincoln's address at all. One of the main ways that Richmond newspapers received information was through an exchange bureau, as when prisoners of war were exchanged, newspapers were also traded. Through the system, editors in Richmond could get the northern papers and figure out what was going on. So the Richmond Examiner was one of these papers. It condemned the ceremonies in Gettysburg as the substitution of glittering foil and worthless paste for real brilliance and pure gold. The Richmond Enquirer said the exact same thing, didn't mention Lincoln at all, focused on Everett. The Richmond Whig got a little bit into Lincoln, but got the story wrong about the Gettysburg Address. The Richmond Whig said that Lincoln was asked, but he declined to make a speech to avoid saying foolish things. Oh, mostly they concentrated on Everett and Everett's invoking of all that classical literature. The Yankees have an invincible conviction that they are the successors of the Romans in empire and of the Athenians in genius. Edward Everett took down his Thucydides and fancied himself a Pericles. The Richmond Dispatch also focused on Everett. Edward Everett of Boasting, Massachusetts. Boasting, not Boston, get it? That secondary and most disgusting edition and representative of the Pilgrim Fathers. After the orator of the day, President Pericles, or rather Abe, made the dedicatory speech, but had to limit his observations within small compass, lest he should tell some funny story over the graves of the immortals. The Virginian was the only newspaper in the state to reprint any of Lincoln's actual words, gave on November 19th. But repeating the words didn't mean that the Lynchburg Virginian admired the man. Really, the ignorance and coarseness of this man would repel and disgust any other people than the Yankees. What a commentary is this on the character of our enemies. So Southern reaction was tainted by the venom of being in the middle of a war and the need to ridicule. How did it become this Gettysburg Address then? How did it become a great speech? I think that after his death, everything was immortalized, and that's part of it. Ralph Waldo Emerson praised it after Lincoln's death as great poetry. I think it was short, and the shortness survives. It became a memorized part of school children's learning, especially in the 20th century. How can you remember what Edward Everett said? But you can remember what Lincoln said, more popular over time. But I would say this, the more I researched it, I think that in order to get there, it had to have some spark in its time. And I do think of the nonpartisan places, Lincoln's short little speech made a good impression, especially as a not-so-popular chief executive, and one that I do believe when he rose, there was some degree of, oh boy. He did a lot to help himself that day. It was one of the bigger audiences. It was a big moment for the Union. So that's the kind of speech that is going to get remembered. You know, this was a president that had just been beaten badly the midterms of 1862 and was facing a lot more criticism in Congress. So I think there was an expectations game even at the time. Let's look at another question, one that Lincoln may be slightly involved with, some say. What is the high water mark of third parties in the United States? Was it when Teddy Roosevelt and his supporters stormed out of a rigged Chicago GOP convention in 1912 and swore that they would return and have their own convention? Was that the moment? Others say it was in 1860, when the Republicans had a kind of status as a third party and took the White House, the most successful then third party ever. But they hadn't run an election before as a major party. So was it back in the populist or Greenback Party days? Was it Eugene Debs and his nearly 1 million vote socialist result in 1920? One could accuse me of a modern bias on this, but I've looked at a lot. And I'd say only one time did a third-party candidate really threaten to take the White House. And that was for a moment in July 1992. At one point in that year, at that time, Ross Perot led the polls with 39% versus 31% for Bush and 25% for Clinton. Highly unusual for an American third party or independent candidate. It had started back in May 1992. Ross Perot made the cover of Time. There were people saying waiting for Perot, a candidate of no party. Ross Perot appeared out with Ed Rollins, well-known Republican consultant, and Hamilton Jordan, well-known Democratic consultant, both with White House experience. Jordan indispensable to Carter, Rollins political arm used for Reagan. According to Rollins, as he would tell the story later, we told Perot that we would need to run a modern-day campaign where we didn't have a primary, we didn't have a political party. To make up the difference, we would need $150 million. You have to remember, 1992, this is a shocking number, because if indeed they had spent it, they would have spent 78% of the total money spent in the presidential race of 1992 as it would turn out. Well, he didn't spend $150 million. Perot would actually spend a fraction of this number. And for comparison purposes, by the way, that was Obama's haul in 1 month, September 2012, of his re-election campaign, $150 million. But the campaign hit some rocks. Ed Rollins turned out to be a particular problem for Perot. He got along well with Jordan, and Jordan got along well with the Perot people. But Ed Rollins leaked his hiring to the Washington Post. That's the way he operated, Washington insider that he was. And then he appeared on Sunday talk shows without telling Perot. See, this didn't sit so well with Ross. He always wanted to be his own spokesperson. That's where he got to where he was. They got into a squabble over hiring a media person that Rollins wanted, and Rollins quit. The next day, Perot withdrew from the race. So when he halted his campaign, this historic but short campaign, so it appeared, Ross Perot explained that the reason he was doing it is that at first he thought he could win, but now the Democratic Party, under Clinton and his vice presidential choice, Al Gore, had become so much stronger recently that he no longer believed he could win the election at the polls in November. Instead, he feared that there would be a three-way contest and the election would have to be decided in January by the House of Representatives. That was a prospect he called disruptive to the country, country first. That was a first statement. Later came out that the real reason Perot quit the race was because of accusations of a series of dirty tricks. He said that the Bush White House was going to publish some pictures from his daughter's wedding or somehow get his daughter involved, and that there would be other dirty tricks involved. Ross Perot had lobbied the Reagan White House for better relations with Vietnam in order to get back POWs, and he thought that they might use that against him. So with these accusations of dirty tricks, that became the reason that he left the race. Well, eventually, both campaigns, the Bush and Clinton campaigns, visited him. A lot of supporters were disappointed with his decision to leave the race, and eventually, on October 1st, 1992, Perot jumps back in. Campaigns in 16 states, he spends not $150 million, but just $12.3 million of his own money. He did some innovative things, purchasing like half-hour blocks of time on the major networks for an infomercial. Got a lot of viewership, and one of his infomercials got 10.5 million viewers. He appeared in the debates. He was judged to have done quite well. And so even though he was only getting about 7% prior to the debates, he received 19% in the election. 19,741 votes. No electoral college votes. So, Page W.H. Brousseau IV writes me on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics Facebook site. Bruce, I've been listening since 2010, and I recommend My History Can Beat Up Your Politics to many friends. Thank you, Paige. Since I was first interested in politics, I've been extremely interested in third or fourth parties. My first vote was for Perot. I understand the ways the two major parties co-opt third-party movements, whether actual parties like the People's Party or in movements like the Tea Party and environmental movements. But I am pretty baffled that regional issues can't produce at least short-term third-party successes. New England has had many independent governors and members of Congress as of late. However, other than Jesse Ventura as a Reform Party candidate, I can't remember much success of late throughout the country. I'm a member of the county GOP and understand what it takes to run a party, but why can't third parties win? Living in a time of Uber donors, funding should be easier than ever. Okay, well, thanks, Paige, and I'm going to kind of dance around the question a bit and then get back to it. I'm going to be positive about third parties, and then I'm going to be pessimistic about them. I think one thing, and I've said this before on the podcast several times, there is a podcast in the archive of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Gives me a chance to plug it. It's available on the website, www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com, available for $25.99. One of the many, many podcasts that are in that archive is The Moped and the Maserati. It's all about this topic of third parties, with a particular focus on John Anderson. So this is kind of like your free sample. I'll talk a little bit about things from that cast and John Anderson and other things. I think one thing, and I've said this before, was the country was not founded as a two-party state the way it is now. should be obvious, but it's just something to keep in mind. Presidential election system is set up to allow any one person who meets the legal requirements of age and residency, etc., to become president. Doesn't favor parties at all. One distinction the framers at the Constitutional Convention made, and they thought about this specifically, were to make the president equal to other branches and not to be slave to them, is to have a separate election for the founders. So unlike the UK or Australia, it's a separate election for the President of the United States, not a parliamentary system where then the parliamentary body picks the executive. It has good and bad effects, but one of the good effects is supposed to be that the president is an independent office. So all of this stuff we hear in the news every day, I use these terms, so I'm not being self-righteous. The president and the president's party, the president's party in Congress, the president is going to lose seats in the House. This would have disgusted your average Constitutional Convention member. They guarded against this type of influence that the Congress might have over the executive. There's supposed to be two separate branches. That separate presidential election is a gift that they gave that today remains towards that end. And in my view, Ross Perot came the closest in modern times to living up to that vision. If he just would have stayed cool, calm, collected, and he would have had to put more of his money. According to Rollins, he was actually willing to do so at the time. It was not a lot of money for Ross Perot to put $150 million to become president. You saw how well he did towards the end of that race, and this is after a lot of people had defected him because he had quit. I think he had an absolute chance to become president if he just would have stayed cool. What can I tell you? It didn't happen. Teddy Roosevelt and his Progressive Party also benefited from the same factor in our Constitution. But a presidential election is separate. So Teddy Roosevelt, forming the Progressive Party, didn't become president. Probably once the GOP and the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party of Roosevelt, split in 1912, probably that meant doom for the Republican side and success for the Democrats. Certainly the Democrats in their Baltimore convention felt that they were nominating a president when they nominated a nominee. But there was still election to fight. And I suppose Teddy Roosevelt could have won, but the vote was split. And those Taft votes were killing any chance that Teddy Roosevelt had of becoming president. But what he did accomplish as a third party was he became the opposition party. I mean, Taft, it was ridiculous, won 2 states. At one point in I believe it was in New York, Woodrow Wilson and Taft meet up and shake hands and kind of exchange pleasantries, and it was a politer time, so I suppose that's normal, but I also suspect that they knew they weren't running against each other. They both had the same opponent. I don't think a third-party candidate had a chance to become president after even the Jackson years, even before the Republican Party was established. Now, I also agree with you that in addition to this gift that we have from the Founding Fathers, from the point of view of someone who wants this to happen and wants to have a independent or third-party president, I agree with you that PACs, super PACs, and the web should be leading to more independents being able to win than what we see in our politics. And it could be the good side of the much-maligned Citizen United. More speech, not just 2 parties now, because if you can raise enough money, you can have your third party. The fact that the president and the GOP contender, Mitt Romney, in the last election, both stepped off public financing means that any advantage that they would get normally, because there is actually an unfair advantage to the parties in the financing system, the public financing system, in that they can get money now where the third party has to wait and get a certain result in order to get public financing later. That should be eliminated anyway because everyone's just raising their own money. But it really hasn't happened. So what is it? Is it that states make it difficult, the signatures, the petitions, the requirements to get on the ballot? Is it the financing? Is it the lack of having state parties and volunteers on the ground helping the candidate? Is it the lack of having friendly governors who can help a presidential candidate along? Is it the lack of a helpful Congress? Is it that people love the 2 parties? Is it that the parties co-op the best ideas from third parties? I think it's a little bit of all of these things, but some more than others. Some more critical than others. So we'll talk about that. 1992, now I would say, looking back, was an unusual political constellation. It could have happened, but you had a weird situation that's a little difficult. An unpopular president, but with a lot of the unpopularity not coming just from people who are normally Democrats, but also his own Republican Party. 12 years of Republican big wins. Not so serious Democratic challenges. Democrats got 45% in 1988, 40% in 1984, 41% in 1980, all lower than McCain or Romney got. There was a wipeout of the party from the White House during the 1980s. So it was a little bit difficult to think of a Democrat as a presidential candidate. And then you had the major candidate that people were talking about was Mario Cuomo, and he decided not to run. Bill Clinton was very well known in the Beltway, actually, and of course known in Arkansas, but not really known amongst most American voters. And here he is, the front runner for the Democratic nomination. And then there were the various character scandals and Jennifer Flowers and the like. So you have two unpopular candidates. Perot is talked about, colorful person, a lot of money, steps in. So you need an unusual set of circumstances. That's hard to happen. Perot was able to overcome one obstacle which is placed in front of most parties, and that's the registering on the ballots, getting on the ballots in all the states. Now, Perot did it. He was in 50 states. John Anderson, in 1980, independent candidate, had a lot of trouble with that, had to spend a lot of money, not just on his campaign, but trying to get on the ballot. So that's a problem for third parties. Could be overcome. Now you have the web and better fundraising mechanisms, better ways to organize volunteers. The debates, Perot was greatly enhanced by being part of the debates, and then in 1996 was not allowed to be in debates, and for that and other reasons, his percentage of the vote was cut in half. There's another factor, and one that I know you're going to think is a little strange. People like the two parties, but not what you think. Actually, in total, and if you did a poll of the American people, they wouldn't like the parties very much. But the people that are supporters of the party like their respective party. So you are running up against a group of people who do care and are unwilling to give you their vote because they want their party to win. Parties, though derided much, do offer branding. So even if somebody's unpopular a little bit, they have something more than themselves because they're a member of a party. With these third-party campaigns, there's very little branding. There's no long-term message. There's no set of standards that they can be judged by. The Reform Party barely lasted into the 2000 election, and candidate Pat Buchanan really wasn't matching what Ross Perot was running for. The media is not always supportive of third-party candidates. And, when they do fall in love with a candidate or not, It usually is not long-lasting. That kind of happened to Perot, where you start with a lot of positive, and then there's negative stories. Same thing with John Anderson in 1980. Positive stories in the press, but as you got a little close to the election, all the stories are about why he could win. Opinion of American people in viewing third parties is important. People don't vote for them. They don't especially have an overwhelming reason to like them. They don't elevate them that much over the other parties. This is the thing that I think is important to understand. Once somebody starts running, they might benefit a little bit from being not one of the two other guys, right? But I think once they start running, they become a politician and absorb the same amount of criticism, blame, and everything. And more importantly, Americans don't think, and this is the critical point, I think, because all the others could be overcome. You could raise enough money, you could get on those ballots. Americans don't think that they can win. So, a crucial poll where John Anderson would have gotten 10 more points in opinion polls, which would have put him in contention in striking distance, 4 or 5 points, of Reagan and Carter, if people thought he could win. So when you interviewed people and said, who are you going to vote for, they would pick Reagan or Carter generally, only a small percentage, 12% or something with Anderson. When you asked them if Anderson could win, if you felt he could win, would you vote for him? He went up 10 points. That's a very important one. Here's another, George Wallace, 1968. Only 4% of the electorate believed he could win. So people voting for him, they're voting out of a protest vote, whatnot, but don't think that they could they could win. The other is that I think the major parties are what I would call flexible tents, and they take issues. They do. And so a third party in one election can bring up an issue that the two guys didn't get to, but guess what's going to happen in the next election? Both parties, for instance, rush to figure out what Perot had done to get that 18%. Republicans hired Perot's pollster, Frank Lutz, and in 1994 tried to attack that group of people, were successful in getting the House and Senate back. Clinton, with Dick Morris, did focus groups of Perot voters, tried to figure out what they were thinking, and to some degree were successful in 1996 getting him reelected. Now, all of that explains a little bit about third parties and the presidency, but it doesn't answer your question, and we don't address Congress. So let's get to your question. Your question is about regional third parties and why it doesn't work. Well, from a presidential standpoint, I think the Electoral College is what kills that off. And the Electoral College is specifically designed to avoid a regional president. You don't get anything in our presidential system if you come in second. So what's the point of starting like a regional third party and trying to run a candidate for president? You know, in other countries, you get a little bit, and you can actually get a lot. So I'll talk a little bit about, in the UK, you have the Liberal Democrat. This was a party that just formed from the Liberal Party in 1989. They had like 20 seats. In 1997, when Tony Blair, Labour Party, gets into power, they get about 46 seats. Their leader is a guy named Paddy Ashdown, really colorful character. His strategy was to focus the resources not broadly throughout the country, but just on the places where they could win. And by doing that, they started winning. And they started at local levels, too, and built their way. By the time you get to 2010, they got 56 seats. The Conservatives don't get enough. Labor doesn't get enough to hold a majority. And they become a very powerful player in a game between the Conservatives and Labor. They side with the Conservatives. David Cameron's prime minister, with the support of the deputy prime minister of the United Kingdom right now, Nicholas Clegg, who is the head of the Liberal Democratic Party. So they had a lot of power and they can influence the agenda. They got a couple cabinet seats. That's not going to happen in the U.S. You don't get anything for coming in second in the Electoral College. Now with Congress, I think the villain is how consolidated power is in the House. So just like you don't get much for getting a few electoral votes, you don't get much for having just a few seats in the House of Representatives. The Speaker is going to appoint people to the Rules Committee, going to have great influence in appointing people to the Appropriations Committees and the various committee chairs. If you're not a committee chair in the House, you're a backbencher, you have very little power. So just getting like 5 to 10 seats in the House of Representatives is so small. And until you get those seats, it's hard to convince voters that you can do anything for them. So I think that's one of the reasons that we don't have third parties. It's all based on our system. Finally, in closing, a little quick Twitter. Ramona White asks me on Twitter, finally following my dream of pursuing my BA in history. Which area, period, should I focus on, either for fun or for future employability? Okay. Well, thanks, Ramona. It depends how you look at it. For fun, I like the area of the 1910s. Anywhere from 1910 to the end of World War I. This is 100 years ago. Many of the political issues that we discuss and we think were created perhaps with the New Deal, or we think were created after World War II, came during that time. Many of the technological innovations were starting at that time. Automobiles, roads, radio. What time would I have loved to live in? The late 20s. In America, the late 20s. Everything was hotsy-totsy. But what area of history do we need more study? I would say post-Civil War, before the turn of the century. So 1870 to 1896, the 1898 Spanish-American War. That period is kind of a blind spot in American history. We should know more about it. We should know more about those presidents. We should know more about what was going on in the South and the Reconstruction and the plight of black people in the South. place the United States was starting to take on the world stage. No, we were not the leader that we became after World War II. But we weren't this quiet little farm country, as sometimes is said, either. Now, in terms of employability, I think liberal arts majors make great business people. So I don't think you should worry too much about that. If you want to teach, teach. And then I guess you have to learn a little bit of everything, don't you? If you're just worried about employability itself, I think people can write and think, make great business people, and you'll find companies need you. I want to thank you for listening. The website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics. Very proud because we have redesigned the website, and there is both a link to buy the archive. There's a link to listen to us on Stitcher. There's also a link to donate. Let's say you just want to donate to the program. I appreciate it. There are some costs with running this program in terms of books and research and various subscriptions that are needed, and the website cost, etc. So I appreciate that. If you like it enough and you'd like to donate, do donate. I don't require it. It's just something that you can do. People have asked about it, and so I'm complying. I've been a little reticent about making much money off My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, and I think that reticence will continue, but with some punctuation. If you like the program, another thing you do to help me out, tell people about it. This is a weird show with a funny name. It's a little obscure. More people should know about it. It's hard to spread the word on the internet. There's a lot going on. Spread the word for me. Help me out. I appreciate it a lot. I want to thank you for listening.